Hello, welcome to A Lesson Before Writing, episode 34. And I'm Ted Morrissey here with my co hosts, one of whom is Brady Harrison. And this is Brady's most recent book that we've published, A Journey to Al Ramel, a novel. And also here with Grant Tracy. And this is Grant's most recent book that we've published, A Shoeshine Kill, his fourth Hayden Fuller novel. You'll notice, guys, that I've got both of your books in paperback. I had to reorder those because I was out of paperback editions. And I will mention that my most recent book is Aspiring Child, a biography of Mary W. Shelley in sonnets. I had my official book launch the other day, or last week, I guess. Maybe talk a little bit more about that. I will say up front, if Brady and I seem a little off of our game, is because Grant is not posing in his man cave where he normally is at, and we're just completely. I thought he was in the National Gallery or something when he tuned in, but he. Because he just wants a different look. Or Grant, I'll turn it over to you. You can comment on that if you like, but the big news is your publication in Dark Yonder. So
Yes,
besides talking about your new location, if you want to, mention Dark Yonder. There it is, Dark Yonder.
like those guys on SCTV. Ooh, Skinny Kids. Yeah, no, I'm super excited. This is like I've been publishing since 1991 in terms of fiction, and this is my most happy and joyous and prestigious publication I've had. I mean, it's
Wow.
a white whale that I've been chasing for 2, 3 years, and I'm rubbing shoulders, elbows with some pretty big names in here. Tom Andy, Steve Liskow, Christina Hogue. I mean, yeah, Seamus Award winners, Edgar Award winners. So I feel like I'm climbing that ladder wherever that's leading to. I don't know, but it's super, super exciting. So yeah, I plan actually. I don't usually do this. I hate to admit this, but I'm actually going to read every story in here, not just my own. So anyway, that's the agenda. As soon as I get through this week, I got yeah, as you guys know. I mean, end of the semester, lots of stuff, theses, defenses, that kind of stuff going on. But this is high on the list to read the whole thing, and I'm super stoked. It's awesome.
So the story is Round and Round.
Yeah.
What is that, a Hayden story? Is that a Eddie Sands story? What
Eddie
is it?
Sands story. I'm in a Eddie Sands groove. I don't know, the Sam Spade side of my personality is coming out. I like a little bit darker. Yeah, no, it's sort of a sequel to the piece that appeared in Black Cat Weekly, What's Your 20, and takes place later. And I the ending, I was inspired. Like I didn't know how to end the story, and suddenly I had an image from a neo noir directed by Arthur Penn called Night Moves, and it's a neo noir I really like, and it ends with Gene Hackman in a boat going round and round and round after he's been wounded and maybe fatally wounded. We don't know, but it sort of ends in the midst of things, and it's this really great ending. And then I was like, how do I end this piece? I want to have something with the kid that he rescues, this young girl, and so I ended it with I don't think it ruins the story. Read it; it's still great, but with cars going around a racetrack, and so and the idea for me is the cycle of crime continues. It's always a Pyrrhic journey. You you solve one case or whatever, and there's another one you have to work on. So that's one of the things that makes it so exhausting living in the world of noir. So anyhow, yeah, that I'm just super proud of the story and super proud that they took it and liked it, and that yeah, this is, I use that metaphor. You chase the white whale, and every once in a while you harpoon one of them. So I harpooned this one. So it's
Hmm. Hmm. So how long of a story is it?
right in the sweet spot. They strongly recommended like 3,500 words was a really good place, 3,500 to 5,000, I think. And my story's, I think 3,700, something like that. So
And that was the original word count. I know sometimes you will trim or
yeah,
whatever
right.
to get under the minimum or the max rather.
No, this was definitely, I don't know. You have to write to the market. Like you still got to be an artist and independent, but you also got to be aware of these parameters. And so I knew the parameter, and I think just intuitively, I know how to tell a story in that length. Like I know how to make certain choices so the story doesn't keep expanding. And I didn't count words, and then when I got done, I did and then it was like 3,600 words. I'm like, oh, beautiful. So yeah, it's an instinctive thing once you know what what the rules are that the journals play by that you're sending to. And I mean, I can start a story and know it's going to be a 20-page story or it's going to be a 10-page story. I mean, it just I don't know how to explain it. There's just sort of there's only so many variables in play, and you put less variables in play and see what happens. And so anyway, yeah, I knew from the start I had it in the sweet spot, and I just kept rolling with the story. And I'm just super excited. And I was one of those stories I had no idea where it was going. It was sort of seat of my pants writing, and yeah, it worked out pretty good.
Well, that's great. I on the other hand, I never know how long a story is going to be, and I've talked about this, maybe did a video about it or something. I can't remember, but I've got as I write, I mean, I'm following the narrative and doing what I feel like I need to do for the integrity of that story. But in the back of my mind somewhere, it's almost like there's like a meter or something. And the more I write, then I know the chances of it being published somewhere are like sinking with every passing word, because the longer it is, the fewer and fewer places will even take a look at it. And so I don't think it changes what I do because a lot of my stories do come out to be 7,000, 7,500, whatever words. But I definitely am thinking, son of a gun, this one's not going to be that 3 or 4,000. It's going to be this or it's going to be that. And when I've posted that online or whatever, I've had other writers who apparently have that same phenomenon happen where they've got this something on their shoulder or looking over their shoulder that realizes, oh my gosh, this is getting less and less publishable the more I write here. So I don't know, Brady. I know you've been just trying to get ready for your retirement and wrapping up your final semester and full-time academia. I don't know. Have you been having an opportunity to write at all? It doesn't look like it from a distance. It looks like you've been pretty busy with all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, this has been a crazy semester and moving out of my office and trying to find shelf space for all the books and what to do with everything. Plus, just the shock of it, since kind of always worked for a living. It's hard to imagine not. So I haven't written a word. Um, but yeah, but switching back, a couple things. Grant, first of all, congratulations. Been so busy, I haven't had a chance to order the publication, but I'm gonna get it. Um, and always love the Eddie Sand stories. And then the other thing I want to say before we get too far is
Oh, I love it. Yes.
these are the stamps that Ted sent the current story to us. That would be Bruce Lee. So I just want to give a shout out. That was so cool. Yeah, no writing, but big plans for the summer.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, well, I'll just I want to give a shout out to my friends in Islamabad. They hosted the official book launch of Aspiring Child. Again, just last week. We had kind of a hard time finding a date that worked, and so even though the book came out in January, I waited a few months. And quite honestly, I haven't bothered to plan a local book launch or reading because the last couple of those I planned, which is several books ago, no one showed up to. So I said, screw that. I'm just going to go ahead where I'm going to go where I'm wanted. And it turns out to be Islamabad, Pakistan. I'm very fortunate that there's a professor there in particular who really has embraced my writing and my work. And so we've developed this very close relationship. And I've given a couple of lectures to the university there. So when I knew my book was coming out in January, I contacted Dr. Gazanfar and I said, you wouldn't want to host a book launch, would you? And very excited to do so. And I tell you, it was fantastic. We ended up doing it purely as a Zoom call. Normally what happens when I do a program with the National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad, they have like auditoriums where people come into and then they project me into the auditorium. And that's obviously very cool. They were going to do that this time, but at the last minute, unfortunately with the war going on, Islamabad was kind of was being shut down because there were supposed to be peace talks going on those days. And so the campus was shut down for a couple of days. So they went to remote learning. So anyway, ended up doing it completely as a Zoom call. But that worked out fine. And there were like almost 90, students, faculty, even a couple of administrators from the university on the Zoom call. everyone I'd sent them a copy of the book digitally, and everyone had read it beforehand, before the reading. When does that ever happen at a reading, And so five students had taken on the responsibility of reading. It's 100 sonnets about Mary Shelley and her life, and each one took 20 sonnets and did kind of an analysis, and then presented their analysis as part of the program. And that was just super cool to hear what the connections they were making and what they were thinking about the work and so forth. And then eventually I had a chance to read some of it and talk a little bit. And there was about a half-hour Q&A. So it was about an hour and a half program altogether, which again is unheard of for a solo book launch in the U.S. And it's all been recorded, and just coincidentally, it's been uploaded as bonus episode 13 of the podcast, so you can find it online there. But yeah, just very, very excited. And then students ended up writing papers about the book, and those were sent to me, so I haven't had a chance to start to look at them yet. But anyway, that's the kind of response I think any of us would want, to have that many people reading our stuff and reading it so carefully. And another student sent me a paper she's working on the Trophies of Job, my novel that came out last year. And again, very critical analysis, very well done. And so I'm kind of reading that and giving some feedback on that. But anyway, just very, very cool stuff. So that was all last week. I'm in that weird time with a book, and I know you guys can relate. And as your publisher, I can relate also. When a book first comes out, you're letting everybody know about it. You're posting. If you're online very much, you're posting. Of course, I'm posting all the time. But again, I started talking about this book last October because pre-sales began in December, and then the book came out in January. But yeah, I keep hammering away, posting about it, sharing quotes from reviews, sharing little things that's going on. But I'm starting to run out of that energy, and yet I haven't really sold very many copies of the book. And I think that's a problem, because it's not going to happen, automatically without constantly kind of letting people know the book's out there and what's going on with it. But yeah, there is that paranoia that you're like that pesky friend who keeps dropping by, that people are tired of. So I get the feeling that my social media followers are tired of hearing about my book and so forth and so on. But yet we know, like in the world of advertising, they just keep hammering you with the same ad over and over and over again. And it must be effective because they do it that way. But yeah, I don't know. I know you guys are super, you're not nearly as active online and so forth as I am. And I'm pretty sure you have that sense of not wanting to wear out your welcome by posting repeatedly about your books and stuff. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on the need to let people know, but yet the sense of not wanting to be in everyone's social media feed about your book constantly. Grant, you obviously are very, very disinterested in being online. And so what are some of your thoughts about promotion versus being the kind of person that gets invited to parties?
That's a tough one because I think part of it's cultural for me. I'm not trying to make excuses for myself, but I am a Canadian, and I was taught, modesty, humility, all that stuff. And so there's a part of me that wants to be recognized, that wants people to say, I love your work. Can I blurb your new book? It's fantastic, And then there's another part of me that's really embarrassed to go around knocking on doors and asking people to pay attention to my work. There's this, and it's not false modesty. I know in my heart that my work is good, but I really have a hard time selling myself, I guess. And it's been a struggle. I remember when I first started at UNI, I was never winning any awards. And then my wife's like, well, you don't make a lot of noise about it. And I said, well, I can't make a lot of noise about it. But then eventually I got some awards, like people just took notice, or I had people that cared enough about what I was doing to nominate me and do that work for me. So I didn't have to be, I don't want to say shamelessly, but for me, it feels that way, self-promoting myself. And so it's just always a personal personal struggle. And then the times where I do feel really good about myself, I feel like I'm bragging too much, you know? It's just always an ongoing battle with my identity. So I totally empathize with where you're coming from, Ted. And it's something I struggle with, I think every day. You know, how do you get,
Right.
you know, like I'm going to be honest with you guys. I've been a little frustrated about this because I'm so proud of this, but nobody's like said to, oh, great, way to go, congrats, you know. And I know you posted the thing out there, and I mean, I've told a couple of really close friends about it. I told people at my church. But I don't know what do I expect someone to come up to me and say, "Hey, I saw your story in Dark Yonder. You're amazing." Yeah, I guess so. No, I'm kidding, but I don't know how to do that part of it and still
Right.
maintain my sense of, I don't know, privacy. Is that the word? I don't know. I struggle with it, Ted, as you know.
Well, I do too. I'm not one to normally be too self-congratulatory, but yet I've kind of forced myself out there to be that way, in hopes that people will respond. Brady, I know you also are reluctant to bang your own gong, blow your own horn, whatever metaphor we want to use here.
Yeah, well, as a fellow Canadian, certainly was raised to keep a low profile, and so it is contrary to my nature uh, to do so. And so, yeah, like you both, I'm pretty conflicted. Certainly would like to see more sales, but in the small press world, we have to put ourselves forward. There's no big advertising budget. We don't have publicists. There's nobody booking us in for readings at Powell's in Portland and, some big bookstore in Chicago. We don't go on tour. And yeah, and I am very conscious of the specter of picking on one's friends. Because like my Instagram account is open, but the professional accounts, they tell you where the traffic is coming from, and it's primarily people you know. So yeah, so I am self-conscious about not wearing folks out too much. At the same time, want to get the book out there. The book's out there. Yeah,
Right.
it's
Yeah,
something I don't think in the course of our conversations, I don't think we've solved this one. Sorry, Grant.
or no, I was just gonna say, or there's a kind of a Willy Loman quality to it too. It's like you got to put yourself out there and knock on doors, and then when I knock on doors of people that don't know me and I get rejected, it really hurts. Like, I've tried to get readings at Prairie Lights, and they take my book and never get back to me. There was a place in North Carolina where I met the bookseller, and he seemed interested in my stuff. I sent him a book, and he never got back to me. Um, so things like that, and then it's like it takes more and more courage each time to talk to someone I don't have a personal connection. I have no connection to the people at Prairie Lights. It's just a bookstore that I admire, and I would love to do a reading in. And I've gone to see people like Chris Offutt and Charles Baxter and other writers I admire read there. But the phone calls never come, So and then it's like with the new book, I get gun shy. I don't want to put myself out there.
Well, part of my issue, I guess, is that I feel like I have been pretty proactive my whole adult life in trying to promote other writers, scheduling readings for them, doing this, writing reviews, of their books and so forth. And so much of the time, it seems like a one-way street. It's just like I'm putting myself out there and I'm scheduling readings and I'm doing all this stuff. But when my book comes out, there's nobody knocking on my door and saying, "Oh my gosh, let's have you to campus. Let's do this. Let's do that." And so that part to me gets a little frustrating too, because you feel like I've compared it to being in a bad relationship where you're doing all the work and the other person doesn't put out the same amount, And I could be surprised. Like I said, I didn't schedule a local reading because of the reactions to the last two, which were both before the pandemic. So it's been a while. Maybe if I scheduled something now, I would be amazed. Maybe there'd be people lining up around the block locally to come in. But
Yeah,
I
I was
couldn't.
just, I was just going to say, Ted, like, I mean, I think I shared this on another podcast, but it's worth repeating. I mean, my daughter has two kids, right? And the first one, Edie, who's now 7, when she had like, I don't know, the baby shower, birthday party when she was 1 or 2, all kinds of people came, all so excited. Then my grandson's born, Luca. He's 4 years younger than Edie, 4.5 years younger. And Caitlin and her husband Nat threw a birthday party for Luca, and nobody came. They all had excuses; they couldn't get there, and that's the way it is with a book. I remember when my first book came
Right.
out, with 12 Winters, packed house, everybody supportive. I got readings in town, blah blah blah, and now it's like, oh, Grant's got another book out, like it's just, and it's kind of how it is, and yeah, it's yeah, it's part of the biz. Brady, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, well, yeah, no, yeah, I concur. I have spent a lot of what I mean, of course, the most fun, and we're so we should say too, we're so fortunate, right? Like we get to do this, and Ted has been gracious enough as our publisher to get behind our work and to send it out there in the world and to organize readings for us and to get us going at AWP, which was a great experience. And at the same time, I think a lot about how one might sell more books. And I don't know what the answers are. So yeah, and certainly there was a bigger and warmer reception for the first book, the story collection, as opposed to A Journey for Owl or Mouse. So maybe that is a kind of it's just it's another book. But anyway, at the same time, people have reached out and really liked both books and been kind enough to say so. And yeah, I guess we don't really even know who's out there maybe reading it. So our work. So yeah, fingers crossed. I haven't got anything else to offer.
Well,
Yeah.
and the other
No,
thing,
go ahead,
I'm just
Grant.
one last thing. I'll make it real quick. I don't mean to bogart
That's
any.
all right. Go ahead.
Um, but the other thing is, Brady and I are both fortunate. Well, Brady's situation is a little different than mine. I get a lot of credit for publishing in my department. So, like, even though I just got paid for Dark Yonder, um, and I got paid for Black Cat Weekly, and I got paid for Tough. I've been paid 3 times for over 50 stories, 60 stories that I've published in my lifetime. But I've never felt like I need to be paid because I get indirect payment, because then I get a promotion or I get a pay raise because my publishing portfolio looks good. So I've always had the scaffolding of the university to support me, but I feel for those people that like maybe drive a bus for a living. And I'm convinced that if I did drive a bus for a living, or if I was an auto mechanic, or if I was a therapist or an architect or whatever, I wouldn't publish half the stuff I published because I don't get that indirect support if that makes sense. So I think there's a lot more people getting MFAs and PhDs that are going the route of the university because then they get benefits and they've got a support system and they can be an artist. It's a lot easier. I'm not trying to denigrate what I do. I just think it's a lot easier for me than someone that drives a bus for a living to keep at it and keep chasing those white whales.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. So much of it is just personalities involved. I've never been a full-time faculty member for a university, but I've been an adjunct at several universities and currently two universities. And frankly, most of the time, yeah, there's not a lot of support there for things I've managed to do, publication wise or whatever. But way back when, for a few years, I taught at it's a little small college, Springfield College in Illinois. And it just so happened that the people there, many of whom were writers themselves, they celebrated everything. You get a story or a poem published in some journal nobody's ever heard of. They're going to have a reading for you. They're going to have a little party, And it was just everyone was so supportive. I remember when my first novel came out, published by a little press, and I spent years not meant writing it, but looking for a publisher. I was teaching at University of Illinois at the time, Springfield campus, and I was super, stoked. And so I contacted the person there that's kind of in charge of the creative writing program and, friend of mine, I thought, and, and said, hey, how about scheduling a little reading on campus? Doesn't have to be anything major, And the response email wise was awfully busy this semester, not really going to be able to do that. It's like, oh my gosh, holy cow. And like I said, we haven't really been too close since then. But it just the personalities. I mean, somebody else would have gone gaga over it. And, another person's like, a little busy. No thanks. I think that there is that in academia, there's either like the supportive colleague or the overly competitive colleague. And it just kind of depends if you end up with a bunch of supportive colleagues or if you end up with a bunch of overly competitive colleagues, how things like that tend to kind of turn out or whatever. But yeah. Well, it's interesting. I've been watching the series Rooster with Steve Carell. He writes like popular fiction, but he kind of gets corralled. No, he kind of gets drawn into being a visiting writer at this little liberal arts college. And so he's teaching creative writing. But it's really funny. I really enjoy it. But in one of the recent episodes, the one of the main characters is a poet. Dyed in the wool, very serious poet, advisor of the campus literary magazine, that whole thing. And she's advising the student who's written this really terrific poem, but is ambivalent about publishing it in the campus review because she's going to become like a hedge fund manager. She's going to get a degree in finance. She's not a poet, blah, blah, blah. And so they have this kind of little conference, the poet and then the student. And the advisor is basically kind of going down that line of thought that, well, you can't abandon your poetry. You've got to be a poet. And to me, they're kind of missing the bigger picture there, because you can certainly be a serious poet, a serious novelist, a serious story writer, and do something else for a living. I remember, 3 or 4 years ago in the MFA program, I had a really, really good writer. And nearing the end of her program, she was having this kind of crisis because she realized she really wanted to be a CPA, not a novelist or something. And so we had a little Zoom meeting. I said, well, that's fantastic. Be a novel writing CPA, and I went through I've done this a lot with students, all the different great writers who did other things to put bread on the table, whether it's Sherwood Anderson being in insurance, whether it's, somebody who's a lawyer or a librarian, yada, yada, yada. I'm just watching a documentary on, oh my gosh, great poet, 20th century, Wallace Stevens. And I guess I didn't realize he was an insurance lawyer his whole career. He had no interest in being in academia or blah, blah, blah. So anyway, this idea that you either have to choose a path of being a writer and somehow maybe by becoming a teacher or something, that's how you pursue that path, or you can do something else that maybe you find enjoyable and maybe is more secure financially, but you can still write really good poetry, really good novels, really good short stories. You can have those two aspects of your life. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. Brady, I've been seeing you nodding on camera here. Is that your sense too, that it's a false, thing to say you have to choose one or the other?
No, I agree completely. And Wallace Stevens, of course, is the famous example. But it must be so hard to make a living, in so many different ways. And so we are all sort of spoiled. Grant and I certainly as spoiled house cats. But yeah, I think there are great writers out there who never, like, I don't know if I can say this out loud, that never got an MFA.
Right.
Right. And to go back even a little bit to some of the other things, Ted, about the kind of environment a person can be in. Like I've loved being at the University of Montana, but it's also overwhelming. Some of our graduates have won Pulitzer Prizes. And one of my colleagues, it is my firmest conviction that they should win a Pulitzer Prize very soon. And Richard Ford has been on faculty, and Chris Offutt that Grant mentioned, and James Welch went here. And so it's sort of overwhelming. It's an abundance of riches. And so one of the advantages, or one of the great things about being immersed in the academic world is there are all these connections. There's all this life. At present, the University of Montana is getting out of the business, as so many universities are, of the humanities and liberal arts. And so there won't be much of an English department left. There is not much of an English department left. So some of that life has certainly cultural and economic forces been drained away. But at the same time, been really fortunate. So I can say that. I guess I've meandered and spun out in several directions, Ted, contrary to your original question. But yeah.
Well, I left off one of my favorites, Bukowski being a postman. That's an interesting disconnect there too. Grant, what are your thoughts? Do you ever talk to your students about you can be a serious writer or take writing seriously and still do other things with your life?
Yeah, well, I've, I, I ask, I think as an academic, the question I ask myself is, am I a writer first or a teacher first? Because I'm at a school where we do both. And I've always considered myself a writer first, even though I'm a pretty good teacher and I put time into my teaching. But my whole identity and my what I bring to the classroom is things I learned because I'm a writer and I can share with students. So for me, um, I've never thought of writing as secondary to my job. I've thought of I just don't I can't make enough money to just be a writer. So I have to have a job. And my job's not driving a bus, but my job's working at a university. So if that makes any sense, like I said, I've only been paid 3 times for all the things I've published. And I'm okay with that because I still get to put things out into the world and it fulfills me. And I put food on the table by being a professor, but I fulfill my own needs by being a writer and working with students. So yeah, that's my thought on it.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, your statement about fulfilling my needs reminds me of something I kind of wanted to bring up too. We obviously often in recent episodes keep circling back to the topic that's probably pretty predominant in just about every writer's mind these days, and that's artificial intelligence. It's occurred to me though that the the concerns about AI as far as writing goes have largely gone along the lines, I think, of in terms of like students using AI to produce their papers for class and so on, that it's really dulling their intellectual abilities. They're not being able to be as analytical and all that stuff. And I think that certainly is true. But I've been thinking recently about another aspect, and this has to do with my interests in trauma theory and trauma writing. And I've said that for my own writing that I find it very meditative and very grounding, and it's a kind of meditation for me and that kind of thing. And in people who write about their experiences, whether traumatic or otherwise, I think it's really a good way to help them process that. And if you're not doing it yourself, if you're letting the machine write your personal essay on, that severe accident that you had or that death in the family you experienced, or, it can still produce probably, tell, hey, write me an essay about my when my favorite grandparent passed away when I was a teenager or something. AI could spit that out in no time, and you give it a few key details, and it's off and running. And you could probably turn it in if you had an assignment like that and get a grade, and everything would be great. But what you're not doing is you're not processing it yourself. You're not going through that emotional, psychological process, and that's my most recent worry about AI, not so much about academic integrity, not so much about intellectual dulling, although that certainly is concerning too, but it's about the fact that writing is such a important way of us helping us process the world, whether you're writing for publication or just writing for an assignment or just writing in your diary, writing in a journal. And if you're letting the machine do that, you're not getting the benefits of that approach. I don't know, Brady, have you thought about that aspect of the rise of the machine in terms of writing?
Oh, yeah, AI is a bane, and part of the part of me that's retiring from teaching is uh, glad not to be reading potentially AI generated work. But I would respond in two ways to your question though, Ted. On the one hand, writing is such a joy.
Yes.
There is so much discovery, and like I hate to use a word that maybe doesn't apply to life anymore, but it's fun. I really enjoy it. And so and it's so immersive. And Grant has talked about this, like, and maybe Ted as well. When I'm working, like time goes away, right?
Mhm.
You become immersed. Like that alone is an invaluable kind of experience. So that's on the one hand. On the other, uh, a lot of folks have said to me, dude, I didn't know you were so, so dark. Um, like you seem like a nice guy. You're kind of always, kind of jokey and smiling and, politely Canadian. But it is true, and this is an oblique answer, perhaps, that the collection of short stories, most of those were written, almost all of those stories were written, and certainly they're all revised during the long course of my wife's illness and passing. And so there's no stories in there that I would say have anything to do with any of that experience. Nonetheless,
Mhm.
the weight of life. And so we don't know how things, come out and what influences and what gives shape. But I would say certainly, and I'm hopefully not just playing little tiny violin here, but some of the darkness of those stories, in my judgment since then, is that they must certainly have been some of the texture and some of the color of those stories certainly came from what was going on in my life.
Yeah, yeah. Grant, you nodded vigorously,
Oh,
especially at the assertion of writing is just fun.
yeah, pleasurable. I don't want to, compare it to sex, but there's you just get you know,
Dude, you always got to talk dirty on these shows. I don't
I
know.
know. Ted, you were talking about a long time, like how your mind goes into a different place, and I find that's not just getting immersed in the story. I feel like a different consciousness is working, one that I don't fully understand, but I love being in that. You call it meditation, whatever you want to call it, like dream-like. There's just something about you get into this world, and that world is way more interesting than the world I live in, and it's exciting, and I want to go along for the ride because I don't know where it's going, and there's just something so pleasurable and so exciting about that. And the other thing, I totally agree with what Brady said. Both his points hit right on the mark for me. The other thing is, I do think, and Brady with the loss of his wife, and for me, I think I'm still dealing with a lot of trauma from my childhood, and so I write these crime stories because people say the same thing to me, Brady. You're such a you're such a joyous person, and blah 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 blah. And then you write these really dark stories, and I I, I think I'm dealing with some stuff that maybe I've repressed, or but it's none of the stories are super personal, but there is themes of abuse, and there's themes of some shit goes down, and these characters learn how to live in those spaces. And I think I don't know why, maybe it's because I didn't feel I had a lot of control as a kid, but I like narratives about people trying to do the right thing and being heroic and going on quests. And there's just something old fashioned about that really appeals to me. Savior complex, whatever you want to call it, it speaks to me. So yeah, I'm on board with the pleasure of writing, and then also how you're working through things, even though you maybe don't know directly what those things are, but somehow through the gestalt of writing, you become, I think, a better person. I think I'm less judgmental. Part of it's, being married to my wife, who's a very non-judgmental person, and that's rubbed off on me. But I think it's also through the power of writing, I've become, not to brag, but I think I'm a more generous person than I was before I
Yeah.
became a full-time writer. So.
Well, I had like a similar sort of, maybe epiphany is too strong of a word, but one of the discussions and questions that came up, from one of the Islamabad students about aspiring child, they were very complimentary and thought that I really effectively talked about Mary Shelley's how the death of her mother and then these other deaths that she experienced very early in life. They seem to think that I did a good job, basically, of kind of portraying that, and asked me how I managed to do that. And I thought about it for a second, and I realized, well, pretty recently I lost my father in 2012, and my mom passed away in 2020. And so who knows? Maybe I was able to relate to her grief in a more meaningful way because I wrote the book now, as opposed if I tried to write it 10 years ago or 15 years ago or something. So I think those life experiences, like, Brady mentioned, et cetera, they definitely filter into our view of the world, and then therefore come out in our writing, in ways that we probably don't even quite understand ourselves most of the time. So, yeah. Very interesting. And I've got other things I'd love to say about some of this stuff, but I guess I'll save them for our next podcast because we probably want to shift gears. And our loyal followers know that we have a featured short story each month. This one comes out of a journal we have not used for that purpose before, and it's COLA, which is COLA Literary Review, is the annual print journal of poetry and fiction edited by graduate students in the MFA program at the University of South Carolina. We're told further on the back of the journal, COLA is an affectionate abbreviation for Columbia, South Carolina, the city where our journal is based, which is all very cool. But I talked to them at AWP. They had a little table there, and I talked to some of the students who were involved in the journal, and I really had a pleasurable conversation. I took about a half dozen journals home with me, and so I kind of feel like over the next few episodes, maybe we'll dive into those. Some of them are very interesting. And so I pulled a story out of here, which I thought has some things worth discussing. It's The Ship and the Rock by an author named Richard Mills. Brady and Grant and I have discovered that we're having a hard time finding Richard Mills online, but that's perhaps a whole nother conversation. But let me just read the opening of this short story and then kind of give a synopsis, and maybe I'll explain why I feel it has some things that I would like to talk about. And so we'll go from there. So this is The Ship and the Rock from Volume 5, Spring 2026 of COLA Literary Review. And it begins. On the first day, I ask, "Where are you from?" as I read out each name on the list. This will take 20 minutes because I draw it out very carefully. "How long have you been here?" 13 years ago, says another speaker. 13 years? Do you like New York? So-so. So-so, I ask. This is what we have in common. We are immigrants, you and I, and we'll talk about how you escaped from Gdansk, like Mrs. Pluchnik, who takes heart medicine at 2 o'clock every afternoon, standing up and walking out to the water fountain in the hall. Please, please, teacher. Or how you stayed here at the end of the holiday, disappearing into the neighborhoods in Inwood and Washington Heights, where there's a Dominican Express office on each of the corners, bodegas that sell yucca and plantain. Is it yucca and plantain? The sound of radios on 165th Street, and the apartments that look out on the Grand Concourse, or how you stood at Newark Airport with your hands wide open, palms up, and said, "I have no papers. Will you take me? I am not going back to Havana City." It's what we talk about. And drawing them out, I pull up a desk and sit in the middle of them to put them at ease, or so I imagine. And then we get one more little line. "You are Canadian, teacher?" they ask. All right, so the protagonist here, the first person narrator, is a Canadian who's moved to New York, in the United States, and is teaching in a program for newly arrived or somewhat newly arrived immigrants who are trying to get their citizenship, and so they have to take a certain number of hours of coursework. So he's trying to teach them English and a little bit about the culture. And so what we then have is, in my mind, a series of kind of character sketches where we're introduced to both some of the students who are in the program, but also some of his teaching colleagues who have their own colorful stories and so forth. And so it's hard to say what the plot of this story is, but one of the reasons I wanted to feature it and to see what you guys thought about it is because it is sort of plotless in the sense that it seems to be mainly a series of character sketches. There is a central allusion to a painting, which I want to get into more in a little bit, but I've already talked quite a bit. But I think that that illusion is very illuminating in terms of maybe what some of this story is about, if we have to say what it's about in some way. So anyway, let me stop yammering there. And Brady, I don't know, what are some of your thoughts on this story?
Okay, well, thank you, Ted. The several things. First of all, as Grant and I have been talking repeatedly uh, over the course of this podcast and every podcast, we're Canadians by birth, and so I was immediately engaged by the narrator, the narrative voice, the narrator being Canadian. And the other thing I can say prefatory that made me really glad and happy to dive into this story is when Grant and I were at the University of Illinois during the summers. I always taught ESL, and it was so much fun. I enjoyed it so much. So what I found though in this story is that this is there's a degree of bitterness. Is that a fair term to use to this? That the joy that I experienced as an ESL teacher is not shared by our protagonist here, and the circumstances are quite a bit different. And so, yeah, I'll concur, Ted, that it's a series of micro vignettes, this sort of the circumstances under which these various folks who don't have languages in common but are trying to get English, and they all come from different places, and so it is narratively, even though it is relatively plotless, it is narratively compelling because of the diversity of this group, and they're trying to find their way, right? The immigrant experience. So it seems, such a topical and timely story in that regard. And so, yeah, I'm going on too much here, but yeah, there's a lack of joy in the experience that the narrator describes, and so that's too bad.
Okay, all right, Grant.
Yeah. Where to begin? Yeah. Lack of joy. I agree with Brady on that account. I mean, the story reads to me like and you guys have already said a series of vignettes, but I was thinking like a catalog poem, like this and then this and this. So we got this person from this area, this person, and then we sort of lose. And that's, I think, is the point of the story, is that the protagonist becomes, at least in my mind, more and more invisible as the story unfolds. Like I keep waiting to hear his story. Like, why is he in New York? Why did he leave Canada? What's he hoping to find here? Why is he so bitter? And it's like those jokes that used to always say, Canadian or dead. When you're trying to figure out, you throw a name out there, William Shatner, Canadian or dead. Well, he's alive and he is Canadian. So I don't know. I felt the story was traveling a little bit in a stereotype that I found disturbing, like the idea of the invisible Canadian. And we just try to fit in. We don't want to be seen. And I kind of wanted, and I don't usually do this because I don't believe in trying to prescribe what a story should be. But I've found myself as a Canadian, I wanted to know more of this Canadian story. And that was really frustrating to me. But that is the agenda. I think you're absolutely right. Plotless and not pursuing that narrative expectation. And perhaps there's a joy in the text for some, but I found myself really frustrated by not knowing why am I here? By myself, I'm talking about, because I couldn't get a job in Canada. I mean, I applied to University of British Columbia. I got shortlisted. I didn't get in. I applied to New Brunswick. I didn't get in. I came to the States, married an American, and here I am all these years later. But I still feel a real strong sense of being rebuffed by the country I come from. And I love the country I come from. And I would love to live there. But I don't know anything about this guy, and I want to know more about him and his psychology. But it's not a psychological realist story. It's something else, and I can't put my finger on it. Brady, on the air.
Oh, well, just I would go even maybe a step further that I wanted to know more about, or I would have welcomed more information and even more insight into any of the characters, as well as the curiously absent
Yeah, the absent one. Yeah.
narrator. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, that's all interesting. One of the things that he talks about is his forgetting knowledge that he used to have, and I've kind of talked about that too. That things I read for my PhD courses, not only don't I can't articulate very well what they're about, I forget that I actually read that before. So there's this sense of forgetting knowledge, and so to me, there's this kind of overarching theme of futility. He keeps teaching these students the same basic concepts, and and so many of them can't seem to grasp them, or they grasp them one day, he thinks, but then the next day they've forgotten them. But then he realizes, with all of his erudition and fancy knowledge, that he's not able to remember much of his education as well. And so there is a sort of disappearing thing happening in this story. And I mean, I want to believe, I want to give the writer some credit and think that the lack of substance of the narrator is sort of in keeping with this theme of the disappearing, the disappearing past, the disappearing knowledge, obviously the immigrant, characters, their pasts are being erased either deliberately or just through the course of time. And so, again, I want to project a sophistication on this story in terms of what perhaps the writer is up to with that lack of substantive information about the narrator and so forth. Everyone seems, you're right, we don't get a lot of information about anyone in the story, but everyone has more substance than I think the first person narrator himself has.
Yeah, and the first person narrator, there's a real disconnect because there's that lady, I think from China, if I'm remembering this right, where
The doctor.
the doctor, she has all these skills, but she comes to, you hear this story a lot. Like they end up driving a cab or something. Like, a guy was a medical person in wherever, somewhere in South America or India or someplace.
I'm sorry to intrude, Grant, but we know that if they start driving a cab, they're going to start laying beatings on people. And I'm like,
Like Eddie Sands, baby. Yeah. So
sorry,
anyway,
but I totally ruined everything there. I
no, you're
apologize.
good, man. You're good. But like, it's there's a way in which there's a moment where the disconnect I'm getting at is these people seem to be running from something to something and away from something and now that's the story of my grandparents. They never talked about it, but there's something going on with the Turks. I don't know what. They had to get out of Macedonia. They came to Canada. I don't know. They never would talk about it, but there was disruption and they couldn't live there safely and had to come to Canada. So I get it, but he seems to have more of this position of privilege. Like he even says that, oh, it's not about running from something, it's going towards something. Well, that's easy for him to say, coming from a culture of Canada, which is really pretty hip and cool, to the US where he thinks he's maybe going to have opportunity. But these other people do seem to be escaping from things. And so he's not on the same page. And that I think adds to the lack of connection between him and the students and him, I think.
Well, and again, maybe I'm giving more credit than it's
Oh, I'm seeing
due.
that as a strength. I'm not saying that's a weakness. I'm seeing that as
Yeah, well, I think that is one of the deliberate points of the story because he says, there's a difference between immigration and emigration, right? And coming, fleeing something versus coming to something for opportunities or whatever. And I think if we wanted to use this story for didactic purposes, which I would hate to do, but I think there is this sense in the country right now for a lot of people, they want to paint people from other countries with the same broad brush. And it doesn't matter why you're here. If you weren't born here, then you're an immigrant and so on. But obviously, there's a lot of different stories and a lot of different reasons for people being here and a very different sorts of backgrounds. And so I think one of the things the story does do a good job of in particular is giving us a pretty wide variety of different students who are in this, and even one of the instructors. She's come from another country, and she's very bitter about the fact her family had all this money and power back in the old country, and now they don't anymore, and so she's got that bitterness, even though she's one of the instructors in this school. And so I don't know. I think a lot of ground is covered in this story. That gets at a lot of really important and topical things, even though it's not going into a lot of detail about any individual character. And as I say, it's hard to say, well, if you had to boil this story down to a statement of plot, I'd be hard pressed to come up with that, because it isn't a very clearly plotted kind of story. I don't know. What about that, Brady? Do you think that part of what's going on here could be that we're given the fact that, even though at times we want to talk about immigrants as if that's all one thing, but they have very different backgrounds, very different stories?
Oh yeah, no, I've been enjoying your insights and analysis, Ted. I think you're reading it even more sympathetically than Grant or I are doing. Yeah, no, yeah, I'll just concur. I like that reading. So say that again, but I want to go back to Ted. Talk about the painting. I think that's an interesting feature of the story. So if you want, if you
Let
would
me
take that up.
introduce it. Let me introduce it since I brought it up, and then let me pitch it back to you because you apparently have some thoughts on it. So the students are always given this assignment, apparently, where they have to bring in a picture, a photograph that is meaningful to them, and then they talk about it. And the idea is to talk about it in English. And so, most of them bring in pictures from with family or from some meaningful event. Well, the woman who we've already kind of mentioned, who's from Canton, she told me that she went to school with the children of an English lawyer a long time ago. She's a doctor before the Cultural Revolution. But for her picture, she brings in a reproduction of a painting, The Raft of the Medusa, by a French painter who I looked up. Jericho, I believe, is the correct way to pronounce it, more or less. And I did. I looked up the painting, and it's a at the time that Jericho painted it, it was of a contemporary event about a group of of people who are set adrift on a raft, and they have to survive through all kinds of means, including cannibalism, and so it's about people adrift, trying to get to another country, and all the things that may occur to them. So let me stop there, and let me turn it back over to Brady. What are your thoughts about this as a central allusion to the story?
Yeah, well, you've thought it through more than I have, but the character, the doctor, who's very precise and uses words that even the instructor has to hesitate over. And so, yeah, the image of the painting captures that desperation and the sense of being underwater, almost underwater, overwhelmed and alone as these characters find themselves, right? They're not really finding much community in the class. They all come from different parts. I've already mentioned that they variously speak different languages, so their struggles with English are all different, but they don't have a language in common. And so the painting helps bring that grief and the strife of it, the difficulty of it all, into focus across all of their stories. It links them. It serves to link them up. And it's very curious that she doesn't play along. She doesn't bring in a photograph, but she's very thoughtful, right? The doctor is maybe, trying to tell, if not her classmates, at least the teacher something more about their experiences. However, they're mostly worried about having to talk about their own pictures. So how much anybody's able to pay attention is uncertain.
Yeah. Well, and so she's thinking abstractly while her classmates are all thinking very literally. and they don't get it. They don't get what she's doing because they're like, it's not a photo. I hear it's not a photograph, and so her classmates think she's really dropped the ball, but we recognize that she's actually thinking more abstractly than what they are. Yeah, the painting, like I said, was the French government got into there was all kinds of criticism of it because they sent these people out on the ship, the Medusa, which was not seaworthy, and so when it sank, they had to construct a raft, and only 13 people got off the ship, and they had to resort to cannibalism before they finally made landfall. And so there was all this criticism of the government. But then when the painter painted this, he received all sorts of censorship, and so he had to go to another country. And so again, I think the painting and the experience of the painter and all that is working on so many multiple levels about what's going on in the here and now of our country, in terms of anyone who criticizes the immigration policy is themselves then criticized, and they're the brunt of all sorts of government, vitriol and on and on and on. So I think there's a lot happening with the choice of that painting. But again, you've got to do some research unless you just happen to be an art historian, art history major or something, and you just know the painting. I had no idea, so I just look all that up. But once you know it, it's like, oh my gosh, there's all sorts of stuff happening with that painting and the history behind that painting that is so appropriate to what the story seems to be getting at, and so on. So I think it's a great example of using an illusion that carries a lot of the weight of the story. But again, you have to have readers who are willing to kind of play along and do a quick Google search and see what the heck the painting is about. We've had we had a story where the Rembrandt painting seemed to be so central to what the theme of the theme of the story was about, which was about peeping on people at night and surreptitious, voyeurism and all this stuff. And the Rembrandt painting seems to be really, connected with that in so many ways. And I think this would be another story we could point to where the painting is carrying a lot of narrative and sub-narrative weight if we just are willing to kind of look into it. I know, Grant, did you have any thoughts on the painting or just any of that stuff I've been babbling about?
Well, I totally love everything you're saying. I did have some thoughts, just little ones, but I use that term from T.S. Eliot, the objective correlative, and I really like when writers pick something, a painting, I did that with my film. So it's like, if you can see the painting above me here by one of the original 7 Canadian artists, landscape paintings, right? So I wanted to do something with that idea, like there's no people in them. And so that became a theme in my film. Like maybe at some point she'll start painting people and get more connected with the world around her. And so the painting in this thing, the title, the ship and the rock, how can I not think of Plymouth Rock? How can I not think of how people got to Americas by ship back in the day? There were no airplanes. That's how you travel, steerage, whatever. So it's like a simple title, but it resonates, so deeply. So yeah, I really like what the author is doing with that. And even if you're not an art historian, I think this is a good thing for our writers out there. There is a way, even on a simple, elegant level, you can kind of get the theme of immigrants and the drift that's in all that stuff, even without knowing that narrative that you shared, Ted. But knowing that narrative just takes it to a wonderfully deeper level, but it still works on the first initial, level. So yeah, I think it's one of the strengths of the piece.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Brady, other further thoughts on that or anything else?
No, just in terms of overall, the Richard Mills, the mystery of Richard Mills. Most of the stories that we have had the good fortune to read and discuss in our podcast, most folks have some kind of online presence. Not everyone, but yeah, it's curious to be to have such a low profile
which fits with the narrator in the story being somewhat invisible and getting lost, and our author is hard to track down too. So I think that's intriguing.
Especially because we've had, in particular, a few female authors who have either deliberately, or we can draw the conclusion, I think, with some confidence, were more online at one point, and then they have backed away from that for various reasons. One of the courses I teach for Southern New Hampshire is on, in fact, for the last couple of years, it's been about the only thing I've taught, which is fine, is on helping creative writing majors and other writerly types create websites and social media presences to promote themselves as authors, to promote their work and all that kind of thing. I have the whole gambit of people, in terms of people who are very excited to do that, and people who have no interest whatsoever in doing that, or kind of afraid of doing that. But one of the things I talk about in that class is that it's not all things are equal for writers, and I just happen to be of a demographic where I'm not nearly at risk of harassment online because I'm a guy, I'm white, I'm heterosexual, and if you're not some of those things, if you're female, if you're part of the LGBTQ community, trans community, if you're an indigenous writer, you're much more likely, unfortunately, to be harassed online, to have your family harassed, to have your identity stolen, on and on and on. So it's very easy for me to say, yeah, I think you should probably have a website. Yeah, I think you should be on Instagram and TikTok and yada, yada, yada. But I also make very clear that it is easy for me to say. And if you're not maybe of that demographic, it is understandable that you would be a little wary of putting yourself out there so much. But so the fact that this is, a guy, Richard Mills, if he has kind of abandoned any kind of online persona, then I'll read the contributor's note. But normally what I do is I read the contributor's note, and then I do a little extra research and, say if they had a website and little other things I learned. But I came up dry, and I told you guys, and we spent a few minutes before we started broadcasting looking. We couldn't find anything definitively either about Richard Mills, the author, but I don't know what that means. So maybe he's hired one of those. You always hear you can pay somebody money and they'll scrub you from the internet. I never thought that could be very successful, but maybe it can be. But anyway. Richard Mills is a Canadian writer currently living in Bath, UK. Richard has placed stories in Canadian, British, and American journals, including a whole bunch of them here. I'll just read a couple. Descant, the Massachusetts Review, Sou'wester, Grain, on and on, Dalhousie Review, Other Voices, Crazy Horse, and so on. Then it ends, it just goes on from there with a lot of other really great writing credits. And again, one of the things we did was to go to some of those journals and search, for Richard Mills, and not coming up with anything. And I don't know what that means. I mentioned to you guys that, and I talked about this in the last podcast, but it just keeps getting more and more invasive and sophisticated or something, that for a number of months now, I've been getting emails to the tune of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 a day, maybe more. People who claim to have read one of my books and want to help me promote it, through all kinds of things, writing book reviews, or maybe they've got a podcast and they want to feature me. But there's always like this, okay, by the way, it'll cost you X amount of money to be on our podcast, or we'll write you 200 reviews, but it'll be $20 a review, blah, blah, blah. And so I just have gotten to the point where I just kind of ignore them. But recently, they've gotten even more sophisticated, where they're like real people with real people pictures. So if you do like a cursory search, they pop up on LinkedIn, and they do represent supposedly I was contacted by an editor at Macmillan who was interested in looking at some work of mine, that maybe hasn't been published yet. And I know that doesn't happen. Macmillan's editors don't reach out to writers, because they read something and they want to see if they have more work. And so I was, but at the same time, you want it to be true somehow. So I did a little research, and sure enough, there is this woman. She is an editor at Macmillan. That's her picture. She's on LinkedIn, blah, blah, blah. But then, you kind of go a little bit further, and there's like this notification on the Macmillan site that a lot of their editors' identities have been fabricated or stolen or whatever. And so there's a lot of emails out there that are, fraudulent. the other, like 2 days ago, I get an email from some woman who's supposedly read one of my books, and she's associated with this radio station, and she does this wellness. Or, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. She does this segment on writers and literature, and then she's got a podcast that's devoted to writing and literature. So I started looking her up, and yeah, she's a real person. It's a real station. She has her actual podcast, but she does segments on health and wellness, and her podcast is about health and wellness. It's not about literature and the arts. And I'm sure if I'd have kept going a little further, it would have been, oh, by the way, to feature you on the podcast, it's going to be $150 or something. So it's just a wild west out there. And I've been doing this for 40 some years. I'm pretty sophisticated, but man, I bet there's a lot of writers out there who haven't been in the biz that long, and they just don't know. I mean, my MFA students are graduating next week. They're submitting their final thesis. They've got to do this. One of the last exercises is they got to write like a query letter, or write like a letter to a journal editor, kind of like a cover letter that would go with a submission. And they really just don't understand a lot about the business. And it's like, I don't know why that is exactly, but I think so much of what I've learned is, for example, they've got a 20,000 word novel that they're pitching to Random House. No. Random House is not going to be interested in a 20,000 word novel. You can't pitch it to them directly. That would be something you contact an agent about, but even an agent is not going to represent a brand new author with a 20,000 word novel, maybe 80,000 words, just things like that. Just no idea about some of those and I obviously try to point that out to them. But my point here, as I ramble, is that even people who take writing very seriously and who are good at writing, there's a lot of inside information about the biz that I think all of us kind of take for granted, but we've learned over 40, 50 years of writing and publishing and blah, 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 blah. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who are just being taken hook, line, and sinker by all this stuff. I don't know, Grant, I know you said you haven't been getting these kinds of notices, but have you heard from any of your fellow writers or students talking about this stuff?
No, I haven't, but it's fascinating and troubling. No, I just you're getting noticed from LinkedIn, or LinkedIn, whatever. And that's all I get. Nobody's, the other thing I get is some outfit that says, they want me to pay to find out who's acknowledging me, or who's, some academia post. That's the only thing I get.
Yeah. Brady, I mean, you're right there in next door to Submittable. There in Missoula. Have you picked up any vibes about all these fraudulent tricksters out there who are trying to suck people into giving them money?
Yeah, I haven't heard anybody complaining, and I haven't heard, say, the graduate students talking about that. But I get those emails too, and at work, luckily the filters, you can ask the IT folks to put pretty wicked strong filters in place, and so I just have a trash bin full of emails that I never read, that are trying to get money out of you in some way or other. Yeah. And then once, if bots take this over, maybe they already have, and that accounts for the proliferation, it's overwhelming.
Right. Well, and from a psychological standpoint, it's interesting because the emails know all the things to say to underread writers, all the things they want to hear, how moving your book was, and they couldn't put it down, and oh my gosh, they lost a whole night's sleep because they stayed up reading my book all night, and all that stuff any of us would want to hear, right? And part of the problem, obviously I still am hooked enough to do further research before I completely realize what's happening, but there are people who sometimes contact us who do want to do real human biological entities who do want us do good things, who do want us to invite us to a reading, who do want us to tape an episode of our podcast before a live audience, and and things like that. And I'm getting to the point where I ignore almost all of that stuff because I don't think it's legit. And so I may be getting to a point where I ignore actual people who are trying to maybe do me some good in the world. And that's part of the
Yes.
frustration too.
Yes, because it seems so fishy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. So it's a crazy world that we're inheriting, by the second or whatever. But ultimately it comes down to it is an act that's joyful to write, and it's good to share our work and all that sort of thing. So let me pass it around one last time. See if you have any final thoughts about anything we've talked about in the podcast, or if you do have anything about the story you want to say further, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Grant, let me kick it over to you for any final thoughts before we sign off here.
I just think you did a good job of empathizing with the story and made me appreciate it a little more than I initially did. So great work, Ted. Masterclass.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Brady?
Well, I'm just thinking about AI and how discouraging all of that is, besides the slop that is getting poured on us constantly, just to remind people, especially young people, we only have this splash of consciousness, near as I can tell, for a limited amount of time in, this vast cosmos. And so getting AI to live your life or to do your work for you seems a shame.
Yeah.
Like you only have one brain. It's only useful for so long. And so find out what it can do and find out what kinds of discoveries you can make. And we've used the word joy too much maybe today, but nonetheless, find some joy. See what you
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah.
Hey, that was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to let that be the final word in all of its wisdom. So, well, this is our April episode, even though we're recording May 3rd. I'm going to backdate this, but I'll be up front with our viewers and listeners. But about ready to send you guys a new story for next month. So hopefully that'll land a little more sympathetically for you guys. But I'll get that in the mail shortly, and we'll find a date here in May. And Brady, congratulations on just about being there with your retirement. And we'll keep doing what we do.